out the extra caffeinated fizzy drinks, try not to overexert yourself playing with your friends that afternoon, and find something to do that'll help you pass those irksome primetime hours. Your reward will come 30 minutes to midnight because that's when Saturday night's main event hits the airwaves in all of its supercharged glory. In the WWF's golden era, Saturday night's main event was required television for young fans that didn't know the meaning of early to bed, early to rise. The exploits of Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and others on national TV defined that period just as much as those hot ticket pay-per-views did. In a time long before Raw, SmackDown, Nitro, and Dynamite, die-hard wrestling fans knew that the big fights were on Saturday nights. I'm Jack from Cultaholic, and this is the true story of Saturday night's main event. It was the spring of 1985 and a seasoned TV executive was looking for a new challenge. Dick Ebersol had up until now been the executive producer and showrunner for NBC's Saturday Night Live for the previous 4 seasons. In the period between Lorne Michaels' stewardship of the program, Ebersol oversaw a cast that included young talents such as Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Jim Belushi, and Joe Piscopo, established names like Martin Short, Billy Crystal, and Christopher Guest, and a genuine transcendent star in Eddie Murphy. Ebersol's calling in life appeared to be developing late-night television. He helped formulate SNL all the way back in 1975 alongside Lorne Michaels, and he became NBC's vice president of late-night programming at the age of 28. While overseeing SNL in the early 80s, Ebersol founded the independent company No Sleep Productions, from which he produced the popular Friday Night Videos in 1983 as a network counter to the increasingly popular MTV phenomenon. By 85, however, Ebersol wanted to spend more time with his young family and sought to lighten his workload. He left his high-demand position at SNL after that season, but not before 2 specific show hosts crossed his path. On March 30th, 1985, with barely half a day until the first ever WrestleMania emanated from Madison Square Garden, WWF champion Hulk Hogan joined tag team partner Mr. T in co-hosting the late-night institution. Ebersol had been enamored by the WWF, especially after it churned out 2 highly rated MTV specials, The Brawl to End It All in 1984 and The War to Settle the Score in 1985. They had done ungodly high ratings, and the NBC exec took notice. Couple that with his personal affinity for the sketch comedy and mock talk show stylings of Tuesday Night Titans, and Ebersol believed bringing the rock and wrestling connection to network television would make for a winning tag team. Ebersol approached Vince McMahon with an idea to bring the WWF to NBC. Seeing as McMahon was continuing onward with his national expansion, it probably didn't take much convincing for Vinnie Mac to sign on. The only roadblock to getting WWF onto the network came at the very top. Young NBC president Brandon Tartikoff was a friend of Ebersol's and trusted his instincts, but he wasn't so certain about late-night pro wrestling. His biggest concern was that advertisers had been guaranteed a minimum rating for that time slot and wasn't sure that SNL and WWF audiences had enough overlap to keep the number at the necessary level. If the show flopped, NBC could lose millions. To assuage Tartikoff's concerns, Ebersol assured him that he could get Cyndi Lauper, who was still riding high in between She's So Unusual and True Colors, to make an appearance. With Lauper on board, Tartikoff gave the go-ahead for a pilot episode to air on Saturday, May 11th in SNL's usual time slot of 11:30 p.m. till 1 in the morning. The taping for what would become the first ever Saturday night's main event was scheduled for Friday, May 10th from Long Island's Nassau Coliseum. That left 24 hours to get the footage ready for broadcast, but in Ebersol's eyes, other work needed to be done long before then. Ebersol was not particularly awestruck by the WWF's rudimentary production values of the time, and found WrestleMania in March to be downright primitive. He wanted the WWF to implement higher production standards for their broadcasts. As was written in Sex, Lies and Headlocks, there will be no more showing up at an arena with a single truck carrying a ring and some lights. Ebersol wanted 4 cameras at ringside with boom mics to catch the grunts and groans that usually went unheard. He wanted state-of-the-art lighting rigs. He wanted concert-quality sound. Meanwhile, on the wrestling end, Vince McMahon booked 2 championship matches for the premiere. Hulk Hogan, accompanied by Mr. T, defending the World Championship against Cowboy Bob Orton, and Women's Champion Wendy Richter, accompanied by Cyndi Lauper, squaring off with the Fabulous Moolah. Along with With babyface turns for both George the Animal Steele and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff throughout the evening, McMahon was loading the pilot broadcast with as many celebrity rubs and newsworthy developments as possible. Adding to the big-time feel was the use of contemporary music. Obsession by Animotion was the show's theme song for its first 3 years, while other songs including Dire Straits' Walk of Life and a-ha's Take On Me were used in video packages. In later years, Phil Collins' Take Me Home served as the closing theme. The show also made use of rapid-fire promos to kick off the telecast, usually soundtracked by a frenetic synthesizer loop. If you weren't already fired up for the show by now, Roddy Piper's high-volume ranting usually did the trick. A raucous crowd of 8,300 people witnessed the premiere edition of Saturday night's main event. Per the norm of the time, the evening was one of babyfaces triumphing over various evils. Once the taping ended, Ebersol and his crew took all of the footage to a studio in Manhattan for editing. Through the overnight hours, the show was pieced together in its broadcast form. The next day, Vince arrived at the studio with wife Linda to see the finished product. As the story goes, Vince was floored by what he saw. Though 1985 production may be very dated by today's standards, especially in an age with trippy Megalodon camera work, the 8K cameras that the NFL and WWE now use sometimes, it was far more chic at the time, and in terms of lighting, Saturday night's main event came off mainstream, whereas WrestleMania felt like it took place in a cave by comparison. To again quote Sex, Lies and Headlocks, it was faster paced and slicker than anything that had ever worn the WWF label. Vince didn't know wrestling could look like that. As for the audience, the 8.8 TV rating was the highest for the time slot since the SNL era of John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd in the late 70s. A very impressed Tartikoff immediately ordered more episodes. Additional shows began rolling out in the autumn, airing on Saturdays when SNL was either out of season or in an off week. Eventually, the show's calendar was settled with 5 episodes, one in October, one on Thanksgiving weekend, one in early January, one in the weeks leading up to WrestleMania, and then a season finale in late April or early May. Early on, the Saturday night's main event broadcast formula came together and remained in place with minimal flexibility in the coming years. And in this formula, the main attraction did not go on last as wrestling convention usually dictates, but instead, the biggest match of the night, i.e. Hulk Hogan's match, generally went on close to midnight, which made it the second or third match on the broadcast. In a sense, this followed the formula of Saturday Night Live under Ebersol's watch. Knowing that a good part of the home audience would peter out by 1 in the morning, Ebersol used to front-load SNL with all of the important stuff, like Eddie Murphy's signature bits, popular characters, a celebrity cameo, and the musical guest's first song, especially if it was a popular chart topper. Sketches that went on at around 12:50 AM were usually abstract conceptual pieces that the mainstream viewership possibly wouldn't care about, which was fine because that part of the audience had probably already gone to bed. As such, Saturday night's main event adhered to the Saturday Night Live template. A hot match kicked things off, and with plenty of energy left in the audience's tank, the super over Hulk Hogan came out next to vanquish the heel du jour. Additionally, by ordering things in this manner, this left plenty of time later on in the broadcast to address any controversy or fallout from Hogan's all-important match. This was the case when Hogan defeated Don Morocco in March 1986 via DQ, only to be violently ambushed afterwards by upcoming WrestleMania opponent King Kong Bundy. Portions of the remaining broadcast time were used to update a hospitalized Hogan's condition, a hook for maintaining a strong portion of the home audience into the wee hours of the morning. And similar to SNL, the last sketch, or match, I suppose, of the night was generally a bit of a who cares affair. Usually, you'd get a low-energy squash match like Kamala over Lanny Poffo or Blackjack Mulligan over Jimmy Jack Funk, strictly for the diehards that were still tuned in. Although all of the top stars of that period were featured on Saturday night's main event at one time or another, the undisputed star of the show was, of course, Hogan. As the WWF's cash cow, Hogan rarely wrestled on their other TV shows, so when Saturday night's main event rolled around, WWF champion Hogan versus whoever was always a big deal, and it was the key to the show's success. Hogan's second title defense on main event, coming against Terry Funk in early '86, set a new show ratings record with a 10.4. Ensuing defenses against Morocco, Orndorff, and Hercules all did over a 9.0 rating, as Hogan's battle with Orndorff inside a steel cage in January '87 set a new high mark with a 10.6. 2 months later, the WWF outdid themselves again as Hogan and Andre the Giant stood on opposite sides of the ring in a 20-man battle royal, 2 weeks before their historic showdown at WrestleMania 3. The 11.6 TV rating for that episode is reportedly the highest that NBC has ever done in that time slot. Hogan may have been the star of the show, but the cultural impact of main event can also be attributed to other important players. The spellbindingly chauvinistic Macho Man Randy Savage, or the unapologetic Rowdy Roddy Piper, or the bombastic musings of commentator Jesse the Body Ventura, and the entire rogues gallery of Hulk-opposed baddies made for one of the most colourful casts of stars that has ever been assembled in the history of the sport. Such was the success of the show that NBC greenlit a live Friday night primetime spin-off to begin in Indianapolis in February of 1988, simply dubbed The Main Event. And to kick off that show's lifespan, the WWF commissioned an unforgettable encounter. 10 months had passed since WrestleMania 3, where Hogan defied the odds to vanquish Andre in the veritable match of the century. We all know it. Andre was granted a rematch for the championship, this time on network TV at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Judging by the numbers, there may have been a few movie theaters and bars that experienced light business on that particular night, because everyone was at home watching the big match. Andre's screwjob victory that ended Hogan's 4-year reign as WWF champion drew a staggering 15.2 Nielsen rating, the equivalent of 33 million viewers. To this day, it is the largest American TV audience for any single wrestling show. Even with Hogan being dethroned, the show maintained a fairly steady audience with eventual champion Savage on top. That said, much of the rock and wrestling flavour had died off come 1988, as was evident in the switching out of Obsession for the synth-heavy instrumental that many fans recognise today as the definitive show theme. The cast of stars had turned over considerably, with the likes of Morocco, Orndorff, the Iron Sheik and Ricky Steamboat fading away in favour of the Big Boss Man, Ted DiBiase, Rick Rude and the Ultimate Warrior. The broadcast formula remained inflexible from its earlier episodes, however, and Saturday night's main event remained appointment television, understandably so, in an era with only 4 pay-per-views. By '89, the main event spin-off had become a February tentpole, a Friday night spectacle that set the wheels of the big WrestleMania storyline in motion. And when champion Savage turned on supposed friend Hogan in an all-time hate-filled rant that February 3rd, the next Saturday night special a month later did a 10.0 rating, comparable to the peak years of the program. NBC then restructured the calendar to give us more wrestling, adding a July edition of the show to help set the stage for SummerSlam. And it was on that first ever July card, after more than 4 years on the air, that the Saturday night version of the program had its first ever title change, as Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard beat Demolition to become World Tag Team Champions. But even with Hogan back on top, the addition of a summer special, and a strong 11.1 rating to kick off 1990, Saturday night's main event began a clear decline at the start of the decade. NBC had scaled back the Saturday night broadcast from 6 to 4 in 1990, but that does come with a bit of an asterisk. Originally, there was supposed to be a Saturday night's main event that aired 2 nights after the 1990 Survivor Series, which would have included the Rockers winning of the World Tag titles from the Hart Foundation. However, NBC made the decision to trim the broadcast from 90 minutes to just 1 hour, and instead air it in prime time 1 night earlier. On the one hand, this benefited the WWF in the sense that the Rockers' Hart match was hopelessly screwed up by a broken ring rope, and excising it from the telecast was now quite a lucky convenience. On the other hand, it was a more long-term sign that things didn't bode well for the show's future. The November 1990 special did an 8.6 rating in primetime, which wasn't the most desirable number, but it was far better than what followed. On Friday, February 1st, 91, the WWF once more ran a primetime main event special, this one paving the way for WrestleMania 7 in Los Angeles. Tickets for the card were moving extremely slowly, due in part to the heavily criticised angle in which now WWF champion Sergeant Slaughter backed Iraq in the ongoing Persian Gulf War, pitting All-American Hogan in position to slay him for the gold at Mania. For a card that included Slaughter versus Hacksaw Jim Duggan and Hogan teaming with Tugboat to face Earthquake and Dino Bravo, the show did a measly 6.7 primetime rating. Part of this could be due to the fact that earlier in the day, a plane crash took place at the LA International Airport, and NBC's LA affiliate KNBC remained live with coverage of the incident instead of broadcasting the main event. But the rest of the country that got Hogan and friends, they seemed to be weary enough by the WWF offering anyway. On April 27th, a more traditional episode of Saturday night's main event was broadcast, and it proved notable because it was the end of the show as we knew it. A month after that broadcast, which did a rather meager 7.7 in the Nielsen's, reports emerged that NBC was washing its hands of the WWF, and that the wrestling giant was now looking for a new home for its infrequent TV specials. The poor ratings of the last 2 primetime airings helped seal their fate, as did the negative publicity around the Slaughter angle. Dave Meltzer also noted that Tartikoff and Ebersol were no longer able to help the WWF in this situation, as Tartikoff left NBC for Paramount and Ebersol's internal power had declined. Meltzer also pointed out the NBC specials drew the largest viewing audience, particularly among the mainstream fans. Indeed, the erosion of the ratings this season seemed to indicate an erosion in mainstream fans, since they didn't coincide with a similar erosion in the ratings of the weekly shows on cable and in syndication. What he means here is, in other words, there was still an audience for wrestling, but wrestling wasn't as hip as once was perceived. Efforts were made to keep the show going on the still-growing Fox network in 1992. A primetime broadcast that February netted an 8.2 rating, but a second special that November, the first since Hogan departed the company following WrestleMania 8, only managed a 6.2 rating. Despite rumors of a March 93 airing to cash in on what turned out to be a very short-lived comeback for Hogan, Saturday Night's Main Event vanished from existence. 13 years later, when the now WWE returned to the USA Network from Spike, they rekindled their relationship with NBC, as both the network and USA fell under the NBC Universal banner. With this new deal came 2 primetime specials on NBC a year, beginning in 2006, and this of course meant the return of Saturday Night's Main Event. But what became evident was that the quaintness and novelty of the old show had little place in the new age. Fans were already used to seeing the top guys wrestle on a weekly basis. You already saw John Cena and Randy Orton and Rey Mysterio every single week. It wasn't like Hogan in the 80s, whose televised matches were rare. And the fans seemed to agree, as the revived broadcast in March 2006 only did a 3.1 rating, despite advertising a guest appearance from Stone Cold Steve Austin. In all, Saturday Night's Main Event ran 4 more times through August of 2008, and none of the ensuing broadcasts came close to that 3.1 number. In fact, the final episode that aired 2 weeks before the 2008 SummerSlam did an abysmal 1.4. In the years since, WWE used their 2 allocated NBC specials to air a shortened version of Tribute to the Troops and a summertime special dedicated to the most recent WrestleMania. It can't be stated enough how important Saturday Night's Main Event was to WWE's total growth. Not only did the series take full advantage of its terrestrial TV home to reach a gigantic mainstream audience, but the necessary upgrades in production aided in its major league feel. It may have only lasted 6 years in its original form, but the show essentially became the playbook on how to run a TV wrestling operation going forwards. It may be hard for fans of the last couple of generations to fully understand just how special, how novel, and how sublime Saturday Night's Main Event was in its heyday. No discussion of glorious golden era WWF is complete without copious mention of the program that commanded sleep deprivation and usually got it without much fuss. Such was its popularity. But like a lot of products of its own time, the concept and the feeling that it once produced are impossible to duplicate in another era. WWE tried, and it didn't work. What made the show special has already been replicated in distilled fashion through other programs and events, and to a fan who grew up on a 2-hour episode of Monday Night Raw, they might not quite get Saturday Night's Main Event. But to others, even those who've come along years after the show's prime, there's a certain innocent magic to the show. It's all the primer you need into 1980s WWF and its stars, frenzied, chaotic, sometimes tongue-in-cheek installments in the WWF as fans once knew it. The top wrestling shows today go off the air at 10 or 11, but to those who know, the real Squared Circle fun began at 11:30.